I knew moving into this neighborhood was a mistake the second I met Patricia Langley, president of the Homeowners Association. She had that pursed lip expression that screamed, "Control freak," and the way she scrutinized my house, my car, and even my clothes made my skin crawl. But the real trouble started when she spotted my service dog, Duke. Duke, a golden retriever with a calm demeanor and sharp instincts, had been my lifeline ever since my accident. I had a neurological condition that caused unpredictable episodes of dizziness and disorientation. Duke was trained to sense them before they happened, guiding me to safety. He wasn't just a pet, he was my independence, my security. Patricia, however, saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. At our first HOA meeting, she made a point to stare at Duke like he was a pile of garbage someone had left on the sidewalk. "Tessa," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "we have very strict rules about animals in this community. Only dogs under 20 pounds are allowed, and they must be approved by the board." I took a deep breath, already sensing the battle ahead. Duke is a service animal. That means he's legally allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Patricia's expression didn't change. The HOA has its own rules. That don't override federal law, I shot back. She gave me a tight smile. "The board will discuss it." I had no doubt what that meant. Patricia and her little squad of busybodies were going to do everything in their power to make my life miserable. And I wasn't wrong. 2 days later, I got a notice on my door. Violation, unauthorized animal immediate removal required. I stared at the paper in disbelief. She was seriously trying to ban my service dog. This was illegal. Marching over to her house, I knocked hard on the door. Patricia opened it with a satisfied expression, like she'd been expecting me. "You can't do this," I said, holding up the violation notice. "Duke is protected under federal law." She crossed her arms. "This is a private community, Tessa. The HOA has the right to regulate animals. If you don't remove him, you'll start accruing fines." I clenched my jaw. "You're discriminating against me. I hope you realize that." She waved a dismissive hand. "You agreed to follow HOA rules when you moved in. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave." Oh, I wasn't going anywhere. I took the notice, went home, and started gathering my evidence. Patricia had just picked a fight with the wrong person. I spent the next several hours putting together my response. Patricia thought she could bully me into submission, but she had underestimated my resolve. I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to make sure she regretted ever trying to pull this stunt. I started by documenting everything. I made copies of the violation notice, took pictures of Duke in his service vest, and printed out the relevant sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then I contacted an attorney who specialized in disability rights. After explaining the situation, she assured me that I had a solid case. The next morning, I sent Patricia a formal response via certified mail. The letter outlined federal protections for service animals and made it clear that any further attempts to remove Duke would result in legal action. I also filed a complaint with the Department of Justice and the state's Human Rights Commission. Patricia's reaction was immediate. By the afternoon, I received another notice, this one claiming that Duke was a nuisance and that multiple neighbors had complained about his presence. I knew this was a lie because Duke was one of the quietest dogs in the neighborhood. He didn't bark excessively, didn't damage property, and certainly wasn't aggressive. At this point, I realized Patricia wasn't just trying to enforce HOA rules, she was targeting me personally. That evening, I knocked on a few doors, speaking with my neighbors. Most were friendly and had no idea what was happening. A few even expressed support, disgusted that the HOA was going after a service dog. The supposed complaints Patricia mentioned. Completely fabricated. Feeling more determined than ever, I attended the next HOA meeting where Patricia was holding court as usual. The second I walked in, her eyes narrowed. She wasted no time bringing up the issue. With a falsely sweet tone, she announced that the board had voted and Duke was in violation of community guidelines. I calmly set a thick folder on the table in front of me. The stack included the ADER regulations, my attorney's letter, and the complaints I had filed. Then I spoke clearly and firmly. I explained that federal law superseded HOA rules and that discriminating against service animals was illegal. I also pointed out that the alleged complaints against Duke were unfounded, as several neighbors had confirmed they never had an issue with him. For the first time, Patricia looked truly unsettled. She shifted in her seat, her usual confidence faltering. One of the board members, an older man named Richard, looked through my documents. He frowned, clearly realizing that Patricia had led them into dangerous legal territory. Another member, a woman named Elaine, spoke up, questioning whether they should continue pushing the issue. Patricia, unwilling to back down, insisted that the HOA had the right to enforce its rules. But it was clear that the board wasn't so sure anymore. Before the meeting could end, I made my final move. I announced that my attorney was preparing a lawsuit for disability discrimination and that the Department of Justice had been notified. If the HOA continued this course of action, they would be facing serious legal consequences. A heavy silence filled the room. Even Patricia, who had been so smug just moments ago, looked pale. I left the meeting knowing that the battle wasn't over, but I had shaken them. Patricia had finally realized she wasn't dealing with someone she could intimidate. Now, it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled for her. The fallout from the meeting hit faster than I expected. The next morning, Patricia sent a mass email to the community, filled with carefully worded nonsense about how the HOA was simply ensuring compliance, and that any legal threats were unnecessary and unneighborly. It was obvious damage control, but the real kicker came at the bottom of the email. She was calling an emergency board vote to amend the HOA bylaws, aiming to explicitly ban service animals over a certain weight. I read the email twice, my frustration morphing into something colder, sharper. Patricia wasn't backing down, she was doubling down. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. She knew she was in the wrong, new federal law was against her, but instead of backing off, she was trying to change the rules to suit her agenda. I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the rest of the day on the phone. My attorney was already preparing to escalate the complaint, but now I had another angle to pursue. I contacted the local news, explaining the situation. A reporter was immediately interested, sensing a juicy story about an HOA overstepping its bounds. Then I reached out to disability advocacy groups, who were more than happy to bring attention to the issue. By the time the emergency board meeting rolled around that evening, I wasn't the only one ready for a fight. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile room with rows of plastic chairs and a long table at the front where the board members sat. Patricia was already there, her expression tight as she shuffled papers in front of her. Around her, the other board members looked uneasy, clearly aware of the pressure mounting against them. The room was packed not just with residents, but with a few reporters and representatives from local disability rights organizations. Patricia's confident veneer cracked the moment she spotted the cameras. Still, she pressed forward, launching into a speech about the importance of maintaining community standards. She claimed the new bylaw was necessary to prevent potential disturbances and ensure a safe and peaceful environment. It was all carefully phrased nonsense, but no one was buying it. When she finally opened the floor for discussion, I stood up, holding a thick folder of newly printed documents. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out, in explicit detail, how the proposed bylaw violated federal law. I quoted specific sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act, making it clear that any attempt to enforce such a rule would put the HOA at risk of a massive lawsuit. Then I handed copies of the formal complaint I had filed with the Department of Justice to each board member. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Patricia tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. I gestured toward the reporters in the back of the room, pointing out that this was now a public matter. The neighborhood's reputation was on the line, and any further action against me or Duke would be seen as willful discrimination. One of the board members, Richard, cleared his throat and asked Patricia if she had consulted legal counsel before drafting the new bylaw. She hesitated, then muttered something about internal discussions. Richard didn't look convinced, neither did most of the other board members. Then, a woman from one of the disability advocacy groups spoke up. She explained how cases like this often resulted in costly lawsuits, ones that could financially cripple an HOA. She made it clear that they were prepared to escalate the matter if necessary. At that point, the tide shifted. Elaine, the board member who had been hesitant at the last meeting, openly stated that she could not support the bylaw. Another board member agreed. Then, Richard flatly stated that he refused to be part of a legal battle the HOA had no chance of winning. Patricia's face turned a deep shade of red. She tried to regain control, insisting that they needed to vote, but it was clear she had lost. One by one, the board members refused to support the amendment. The motion failed before it even reached a vote. The room erupted into murmurs, a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. As the meeting wrapped up, Patricia stormed out, her composure completely shattered. She had been outmaneuvered and she knew it. I exhaled, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally ease. Duke, sensing the shift in mood, nudged my hand, his steady presence grounding me. The battle was over, and I had won. In the days following the failed bylaw amendment, Patricia's grip on the HOA began to unravel. The backlash was swift and brutal. Residents who had previously kept their heads down started voicing their frustrations, emboldened by the public humiliation she had suffered at the emergency meeting. It turned out I wasn't the first person Patricia had tried to strong-arm. Over the years, she had fined people for trivial violations, denied reasonable requests for property modifications, and even attempted to have a veteran's flagpole removed because it didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Now that her abuse of power had been exposed on a much larger scale, the community was ready to push back. The local news had run a segment about my case, framing it as a clear-cut instance of HOA overreach. A reporter had managed to corner Patricia for a brief interview, during which she had floundered, offering vague justifications that did nothing to help her case. The segment ended with a legal expert explaining how my federal complaint could result in serious consequences for the HOA if they didn't change course. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. The usual air of quiet submission had been replaced by something far more dangerous for someone like Patricia open defiance. The clubhouse was packed well beyond the usual turnout. People who had never attended a meeting before showed up, many of them holding copies of the ADER regulations I had distributed. Discussions before the meeting started weren't just about Duke anymore. Residents were murmuring about financial mismanagement, selective enforcement of rules, and other grievances that had been ignored for years. When Patricia entered, she didn't carry herself with the same smug confidence as before. She moved quickly to her seat, avoiding eye contact with the growing crowd. The rest of the board members followed, some looking outright uncomfortable. Richard, the board member who had questioned Patricia's legal knowledge at the last meeting, wasted no time. He called the meeting to order and immediately brought up the elephant in the room, the federal complaint. Patricia tried to control the narrative, insisting that the board had acted within its authority. But before she could get too far, Elaine cut her off. She had done her own research and wasn't willing to let Patricia manipulate the discussion. She pointed out that the HOA's legal fund was not equipped to handle a federal lawsuit, and that any further resistance would not only be futile but financially disastrous for the entire community. That was when another resident, a retired attorney named Greg, stood up. Unlike Patricia, he knew what he was talking about. He calmly explained that if the HOA continued its course, they could face fines, legal fees, and even a court order forcing them to comply with federal law. He then asked a pointed question: who exactly had authorized Patricia to pursue this in the first place? A tense silence followed. Patricia looked flustered. She started rambling about acting in the best interest of the community, but Greg wasn't having it. He pressed further, asking whether there had been a formal vote before she issued the violation notice against me. When no board member could answer, the room erupted. Residents were furious. This wasn't just about Duke anymore, it was about Patricia's unchecked power. People started shouting about their own experiences being bullied by the HOA, about fines they had paid without question, about the arbitrary way rules were enforced. Seeing the tide turning against her, Patricia tried a last-ditch effort to regain control. She declared that since she was still president, she had the authority to make executive decisions when necessary. That was when Richard, who had been largely silent until now, spoke up again. He calmly stated that Patricia's position as president was not absolute and that the HOA bylaws allowed for a recall vote if enough residents supported it. Then, he pulled out a petition. Elaine had been working behind the scenes, gathering signatures from residents fed up with Patricia's leadership. She had more than enough to force a vote. Patricia went pale. She tried to argue that the petition was invalid, that the signatures hadn't been properly collected, but no one was listening anymore. The room was buzzing with energy. The board was forced to acknowledge the petition, and a recall vote was scheduled for the following week. Patricia stormed out before the meeting even ended. Over the next few days, her desperation became more apparent. She sent out frantic emails trying to rally support, but few people responded. The community had turned on her. By the time the recall vote took place, the outcome was inevitable. Patricia was removed from her position in a landslide. Richard was elected as interim president, and one of the first things he did was formally rescind the violation notice against Duke. The legal complaint I had filed was still pending, but with Patricia out of power and the new leadership working to correct her mistakes, I was willing to negotiate. My attorney and I reached an agreement with the HOA's new board. They would issue a formal apology, implement mandatory training on federal disability laws, and ensure that no future resident faced the kind of discrimination I had. As for Patricia, she vanished from the community almost overnight. Her house went up for sale within the month, and she moved without so much as a word. Duke and I stayed. And every time I walked through the neighborhood with him by my side, I could feel the difference. The tension that had once hung over the community was gone. People smiled more. They spoke up when something wasn't right. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone. With Patricia gone, the neighborhood started to breathe again. The HOA, under Richard's leadership, began making serious changes. The first order of business was cleaning up the mess Patricia had left behind. The community's finances were a disaster. Richard and Elaine, along with a few other board members, dug through years of records and found troubling discrepancies. Funds had been allocated for projects that were never completed, and certain vendors had been overpaid for services that seemed suspiciously vague. It wasn't outright embezzlement, but it was clear that Patricia had been using the HOA's money to benefit herself and her inner circle. Richard, determined to restore trust, brought in an outside auditor. The findings were worse than expected. Thousands of dollars had been wasted on unnecessary legal fees for battles. Patricia had fought against homeowners who had challenged her authority. Landscaping costs were inflated because she had hired a company owned by her cousin. Even the clubhouse renovations, which had supposedly drained a significant portion of the HOA's budget, turned out to be vastly overpriced. At the next community meeting, Richard laid everything out. The residents, already frustrated by Patricia's antics, were livid. People started demanding refunds, restitution, and accountability. It was clear that Patricia's departure wasn't enough. There needed to be consequences. Elaine suggested legal action. The HOA had grounds to sue Patricia for financial mismanagement, and the residents overwhelmingly supported the idea. A vote was taken, and the decision was made to pursue legal action against her. Meanwhile, news of Patricia's downfall continued to spread. The local news station that had covered my case did a follow-up story on the financial mismanagement. The segment painted Patricia as the textbook example of HOA corruption. A few former board members, now eager to distance themselves from her, came forward with additional stories about how she had pressured them into approving shady decisions. The lawsuit against Patricia moved forward quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and rather than face a lengthy legal battle, she settled out of court. She was forced to pay back a significant portion of the misused funds, and a lien was placed on her property to ensure full repayment. With Patricia no longer a threat, I focused on making sure the neighborhood never fell into the same trap again. I proposed a set of new HOA regulations designed to prevent abuse of power. These included mandatory transparency in financial decisions, strict limits on unilateral actions by the president, and a requirement that any rule changes be subject to a full community vote. The new board embraced the reforms. They wanted to avoid another Patricia situation just as much as I did. As the months passed, things finally settled into a new, healthier normal. The HOA, once a tool for control and intimidation, became what it was supposed to be: a community organization that actually served the residents. People who had once feared speaking out now actively participated in meetings. One afternoon, I was out walking Duke when an older woman named Marjorie waved me over. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had seen Patricia's reign from the beginning. She told me she had been planning to sell her house and leave before everything changed, but now she had decided to stay. For the first time in years, she felt like the neighborhood belonged to the people again. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had fought for Duke, but in the process, I had helped give the entire community its freedom back, and that was a victory worth more than anything. With Patricia out of power and the community moving in a better direction, I expected things to settle down. But the damage left in her wake had deeper roots than I initially realized. Some of her former allies on the board, though now distancing themselves from her, still resisted the reforms I had helped implement. They weren't outright defying the changes, but they dragged their feet when it came to enforcing transparency and accountability. Richard and Elaine were doing their best to push things forward, but I could tell they were facing resistance behind closed doors. The remaining board members, particularly a man named Gerald, weren't thrilled about relinquishing the unchecked power they had enjoyed under Patricia's rule. Gerald had been a staunch supporter of hers for years, and while he wasn't foolish enough to openly defend her now, I could see he was waiting for an opportunity to claw back some control. That opportunity came sooner than expected. One morning, I received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't a violation notice this time. No one was foolish enough to challenge Duke's presence anymore, but it was equally frustrating. The letter detailed a new set of proposed community regulations, ones that, on the surface, seemed minor. But when I read through them carefully, certain phrases stood out. There were vague restrictions on excessive use of shared spaces, new fees for additional property inspections, and a clause that allowed the board to impose adjustments to homeowner obligations without requiring a full community vote. It was a power grab disguised as administrative housekeeping. I wasn't the only one who noticed. That evening, I met with Richard and Elaine at the clubhouse to discuss the letter. Richard was clearly frustrated, his usual calm demeanor strained. Elaine, on the other hand, was furious. She laid the document flat on the table and pointed to the most concerning sections. These changes would give the board more unchecked authority, allowing them to fine homeowners at their discretion, and conduct property inspections without notice. It was a loophole-ridden mess that could easily be exploited, and Gerald was behind it. Richard confirmed that the proposed regulations had come from Gerald's side of the board. He had drafted them quietly, presenting them as minor administrative updates to avoid drawing attention. The plan was to pass them in the next board meeting, hoping no one would scrutinize them too closely. They had underestimated us. Elaine and I spent the next several days reaching out to homeowners, making sure they understood what was at stake. Most people were already wary of anything that smelled like HOA overreach, and once they saw how these changes mirrored some of Patricia's worst abuses, they were ready to fight back. By the time the board meeting arrived, the clubhouse was packed. More residents had shown up for this than even Patricia's recall vote. Gerald, clearly unnerved by the turnout, tried to maintain control, but the atmosphere had shifted. He attempted to present the regulatory changes as routine, but before he could finish, Richard cut in, laying out exactly how these new rules would strip homeowners of their rights. Elaine followed, pointing out specific clauses that would allow the board to impose fines without oversight. She then produced a list of signatures from residents demanding a full vote before any changes to community regulations could be enacted. Gerald tried to argue, but the crowd wasn't having it. Homeowners began calling him out, questioning his motivations and demanding transparency. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear he was losing control of the situation. Then one of the newer board members, a woman named Tessa, spoke up. She had been quiet up to this point, but now she openly admitted that Gerald had rushed the proposal through without proper discussion. She confirmed that he had pressured board members to support it, using vague justifications about streamlining governance. That was the breaking point. Gerald, seeing the tide turning completely against him, made a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. He suggested tabling the discussion for another time, hoping to delay the inevitable. But Richard wasn't letting him off the hook. He called for an immediate vote to reject the proposal entirely. It wasn't even close. The board shot it down, and the residents erupted into applause. Gerald, humiliated and outmaneuvered, resigned from the board the following week. Without Patricia or him, the last remnants of their old power structure crumbled. With real transparency finally taking root, the neighborhood transformed. Meetings became productive discussions instead of battlegrounds. Financial records were published regularly, and homeowners had real input in decision-making. People who had once kept their heads down now actively participated, ensuring that no one like Patricia or Gerald could ever take control again. As for me, I finally had peace. Duke and I could walk through the neighborhood without a lingering sense of dread. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The HOA was no longer a weapon. It was what it was supposed to be, a community.